March 11th, 2020. It's a chilly morning in Colorado Springs, Colorado, the Centennial State's second largest city.
Colorado Springs is one of the most beautiful cities in the country.
It's one of the top places in the United States to live.
It is home to Pikes Peak, home to a lot of great hiking, picturesque views.
However, on this Wednesday, one Colorado Springs resident is too anxious to take in the natural beauty around her.
Carlene Blower was worried because it had been 3 days since she talked to her 28-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Kramer. She has not returned any of her calls.
Initially, it wasn't too concerning because Elizabeth was grown and she was living her life.
But now she's learned that no one else has heard from Elizabeth either.
I haven't talked to her in a couple of days, and that's not like her to not call me.
Carlene heard from her daughter's boyfriend, George Little, and he said that he had not seen Elizabeth in several days. She then called Elizabeth's ex, the father of her 2 kids, Davion Rogers. Davion says that he has not seen or heard from Lizzie since Sunday night as well.
Okay, I'll call you back.
When Carlene contacts the healthcare center where Elizabeth works,
She hasn't worked for several shifts.
her fear turns to panic.
She had not been to her shifts. She had not called in. They have not heard anything from her in about 3 days.
This is unlike Elizabeth.
Now convinced that something terrible has happened to her daughter, Carlene decides to call the Colorado Springs Police Department to ask for help.
Colorado Springs Police and Fire, how may I help you?
Yes, I am calling because I have concerns about my daughter and I don't know how to do a welfare check for her.
It's every mother's worst fear for your child to be missing, to not know what's going on.
Elizabeth Kramer was Lizzie to her family and friends, and to everyone else, she was the life of the party.
Lizzie was a very joyful person, and she knew no strangers.
She was a ball of fun.
So how's work going? It's going great. I'm making lots of new friends.
The kind of person who savored the simple life, Lizzie was happy to spend her days enjoying the company of close friends and family.
At the end of the day, what mattered most to her was spending time with her loved ones.
She is very fun-loving, and that's very endearing for all of her friends and family who just love being around her.
She brought the same infectious enthusiasm to her romantic relationships, especially when she met a man named Davion Rogers.
In 2016, Elizabeth and Davion came together in what you could really call a whirlwind romance.
It was an instant attraction.
I knew at the moment I saw you standing there.
What did you know?
She's young, he's young. He got a little swagger to him.
That'd be a shame if I didn't introduce myself.
Every woman wants a confident man. She bites. They start this relationship.
Stop it.
It was fun, it was exciting, it was energetic.
And before long, it was serious.
Within 3 years, they had already had 2 children, and they were talking about getting married.
But just as the relationship started to look like it would last, Lizzie and Davion began to drift apart.
Their relationship kind of hit a rock. It began to grow stagnant.
They've lost connection, lost communication.
Eventually, they decided it was time to move on.
They ended up separating.
Lizzie understood that it was either stay here and be stagnant or move on and grow and find that one true love.
And it didn't take her long to find Mr. Right.
After Elizabeth and Davion broke up, she started a new job at a healthcare company.
In the course of her new job, she met George Little.
You look great today.
Thanks. So do you.
George was several years younger than Elizabeth, but he had the same enthusiastic personality.
She's had the opportunity to see him every day, get to know him. She see that he's ambitious, he's driven.
They would talk and they would laugh and have these great interactions at work, and that eventually spilled over into their personal lives after work.
What are you doing later today?
Nothing right now.
Lizzie and George's relationship progressed pretty quickly. At the end of that year, they had decided to move in together.
The decision to live together came with its own problems.
At that time, George was living in a small apartment.
There wasn't enough room for Lizzie and her children to move in with him.
It was very heartbreaking for her to have to be separated from them.
But by early 2020, George and Elizabeth found a new apartment.
Their new place was big enough for them and her kids.
She was in a position where she and Davion could have split custody of the children.
She was feeling very hopeful for the future for her, George, and the kids.
But now, Elizabeth's mother is telling the police that no one has heard from her daughter in 3 days.
Children's father concerned for her, and her boyfriend's concerned for her, and I'm concerned for her.
And she has a special reason to be worried.
According to her mother, Elizabeth had been suffering from emotional problems ever since giving birth to her last child.
After childbirth, the levels of estrogen and progesterone in women severely drop, which can lead to depression.
I'm concerned that her severe postpartum depression has caused her to make some unsafe decisions.
Carlene is concerned that her daughter may have hurt herself.
She has been self-medicating with supposedly drugs and alcohol.
No parent would think that their child will commit suicide.
The life of Colorado Springs healthcare worker and mother of two, Elizabeth Kramer, had become a daily struggle.
After Lizzie had her last child, she had been suffering with a severe bout of postpartum depression.
She was falling into a deep hole.
But in the fall of 2019, it appeared to her family that she was finally making improvements.
She had gotten a job at a healthcare facility, and she was really enjoying what she did.
She started a new relationship with a guy from work named George Little, who seemed to really adore her.
You look great.
And she'd started working on a custody arrangement with her ex and father of her kids, Davion Rogers.
That is an incredible feeling like everything is working out.
But now, her mother has called the Colorado Springs police to report her daughter missing.
Carlene hadn't heard from Elizabeth in 3 days, and that gave her cause for alarm.
Her anxiety was through the roof.
Carlene tells the police that she's afraid her daughter's disappearance might be connected to her postpartum depression.
Her mother is concerned that she might have done something to hurt herself.
Do you know where she is right now?
I don't. I have no idea.
Okay, so we can air information to officers in the area so they can start looking for her.
After the call, Elizabeth's mother heads to the police station to give detectives more information.
You want to take a seat here?
So, when was the last time you saw your daughter?
It was on Thursday. We had lunch and like a mother's daughter spa day.
Lizzie seemed normal, and she was telling her mom how excited she was to see her children again on Sunday for dinner.
They spoke again on Sunday prior to Elizabeth picking up the boys.
But a couple of days later, Carlene got a disturbing call.
George, Lizzie's current boyfriend, calls Carlene and tells her that he's concerned about her whereabouts.
He said the last time that he saw her was on Sunday. just before she went to pick up her kids.
From their father?
Yes, Davion Rogers.
Carlene, of course, immediately calls Davion.
Davion let her know that, yes, Lizzie had come by the house. She picked up the children around 5 p.m. She dropped them back off around 7 p.m. and she left, and he hadn't heard from her either.
Even more concerning is that Carlene believes her daughter has been self-medicating for her depression.
Her mom thought that maybe she was in such a severe state of postpartum depression that maybe she was indulging in prescription medication.
What makes you think that?
Because when I talked to Davion, he told me some things.
Davion told Carlene that Lizzie stole prescription painkillers from him.
He said she was stealing pain medication from him and disappearing for days on end.
I'm just so afraid. I'm afraid that she may have done something to herself.
The detectives share Carlene's concern.
The police are convinced that there's sufficient cause for worry, so they issue a BOLO for Elizabeth's car, and they start the process of obtaining warrants to look into her bank account records, her social media records.
While waiting on a response to the warrants, investigators start conducting interviews with those closest to Elizabeth.
They want to know everybody that she talked to in the days leading up to her disappearance.
They start with the last person known to have seen her, her ex-boyfriend, Davion Rogers.
When was the last time you saw Elizabeth?
She came over here on Sunday.
Davion told him that Lizzie came over around 5 p.m.
She picked up the kids and took them out to dinner. Then she dropped them back off at around 7 o'clock.
After that, he never seen her again.
Davion admits that things have been tense between him and his ex lately.
Davion says that he has been fighting Lizzie for custody of their 2 children.
Why don't you want her to have custody?
Because I don't trust that she'll take care of the kids.
He says that she has been irresponsible. She's disappeared for days without contacting him or the children.
Davion also confirms Carlene's suspicions that Elizabeth was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol.
He says that she has been abusing drugs, and she has also stolen pain medication from him.
I have to ask you this. Did you have anything to do with Elizabeth disappearing?
No, sir.
Davion said that even though he didn't want her to have custody, she was still the mother of his children.
Although they had their issues, he was super worried about her.
But before investigators leave, Davion brings up something else that he says has been troubling him.
Did you ask George?
You mean George Little?
Yeah, the guy she's been living with.
He really thinks there's something deeper going on.
He believes that her new boyfriend, George, has something to do with her disappearance.
Police in Colorado Springs have learned that missing 28-year-old Elizabeth Kramer was struggling with postpartum depression and drug use.
Postpartum depression is something that so many women suffer from after having a baby. It puts them in a very dark, negative space that is dangerous.
But now her ex-boyfriend, Davion Rogers, has told investigators that he doesn't believe an overdose or suicide is behind her disappearance.
Davion does not believe that Lizzie hurt herself.
He thinks that the new boyfriend, George, has something to do with Lizzie going missing.
Why do you think George might be involved?
Because the way she was when she came over on Sunday.
But on this particular day, her behavior was just very strange and very out of character. Normally, when Lizzie comes to pick up the kids, Davion brings them down to the car, he loads them in, and everything is fine.
But on Sunday, she took the kids and their backpacks down to the car herself.
He believes that it's because George was with her.
George was in the car and Lizzie was trying to keep them apart.
He said she seemed like she was afraid of George.
If Davion is correct, it contradicts what George told Elizabeth's mother.
George says the last time he saw Lizzie was when she left the apartment to go pick up her kids for dinner.
That means George was actually the last person that saw Lizzie alive.
After talking to Davion, investigators ask George Little to come in for an interview.
He tells police officers that he will do anything to help find Lizzie.
How are things between you and Elizabeth?
Good. Really good.
He tells them that things were going great with him and Lizzie, that they were happy.
Did you go with her to get the kids?
No, I never go with her.
You sure about that?
Davion seemed pretty convinced that George was in the car while Elizabeth was picking up the kids. So detectives just came right out and asked him whether or not he was involved.
Did you have anything to do with her disappearance?
Man, I'm trying to help find her. Why would you ask me that?
He stated that he loved her a lot and that he would never harm her.
But he says he knows someone who could.
While Davion was pointing the finger at George, George actually says they need to be looking at Davion.
That guy's scary.
What do you mean?
He said that Davion was very jealous of him to the point that he would actually threaten him.
George also claims that Davion's stories about Elizabeth's drug use are outright lies.
George tells the police that the most she has ever done is drink and maybe some marijuana, which is legal in Colorado, but she has never done anything harder than that.
He lets the police know that Davion had been feeding Lizzie's mom different stories about her drug use and disappearances.
I know one thing for sure. If something happened to her, it wasn't suicide.
George wasn't concerned that Lizzie did something to herself. He was concerned that Davion did something to her.
Investigators have now heard two different stories from Elizabeth's boyfriend and her ex, but they don't know which one is true.
Detectives subpoenaed both of their internet and phone records to see what was really going on between them and Lizzie.
However, they're still waiting for the results when they get their first big break in the case.
Detectives were notified that a 911 call came in earlier that morning reporting a suspicious abandoned vehicle.
Hello, Springs Police Fire. How can I help you?
Who do you talk to if reported if a vehicle might be stolen?
Is it your vehicle?
No, it's actually been parked on the street. Just in for once, I just want to make sure it's stolen.
Okay. An officer will be dispatched as soon as possible.
When police ran the plates, they discovered that it's Elizabeth's SUV.
Patrol officers contacted the detectives who were working the case, and they came out to search the car and the surrounding areas.
They did not find Lizzie inside of or around the car. However, they did find red stains in the car.
They noticed something that looks like blood smear on the car seats, which is not a good sign in any missing persons case.
Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, hoping someone saw the person who abandoned the vehicle.
No one has seen anything or heard anything.
It's not looking good at this point. There's not a whole lot to go on in terms of where she is.
Until a few days later, when there's another break in the case. It starts with two teenagers in the mountains outside Colorado Springs.
They were hiking. They found this 50-gallon bin.
It was a plastic tote that had been duct tape closed.
It immediately piques their curiosity.
The teenagers got really curious and they cut the duct tape off.
When they open this bin, they find a body there.
This missing persons case turned into a homicide investigation.
2 weeks after 28-year-old mother of two Elizabeth Kramer disappeared, hikers outside Colorado Springs have stumbled across a dead body in the woods.
I can't even fathom what they were experiencing in that moment. I'm sure fear and confusion. Like, what is happening right now and what do I do about it?
Detectives are quickly called to the scene to make a positive identification.
They would need to run her prints to confirm, but the detectives were fairly certain that the woman in the tote was Elizabeth Kramer.
Detectives also had a theory for how she ended up there.
There was a road that ran atop a cliff overlooking the spot where the tote was found.
It looks like it was pushed off the edge.
It's clear, this is a dumping ground. This is not where the actual murder occurred.
But it's not clear how she died.
There was really no trauma that they can see that was done to the body.
It's not until they get to the autopsy that they're able to determine a cause of death.
The post-mortem exam reveals a phenomenon known as petechia, burst blood capillaries.
The medical examiner was able to determine that there were tiny blood vessels in Elizabeth's eyes that were broken.
It's a clear sign that Elizabeth had been strangled to death.
The amount of passion and rage that it takes to strangle somebody to death is crazy.
But who had that kind of rage against Elizabeth Kramer?
The obvious suspects were the men in her life, her boyfriend, George, or her ex, Davion. But it was also possible that Elizabeth was involved with someone her family or her boyfriend didn't know about.
Looking for answers, investigators interview people at the healthcare company where she and George both worked.
When police speak with Lizzie's co-workers, they discuss how devastated and heartbroken they are to have lost her.
As far as her co-workers are concerned, one suspect can be ruled out.
Lizzie's co-workers said that she was extremely happy with George.
There's no way George was involved.
But that's not what they say about Davion.
Davion was a bad guy.
Lizzie had confided in them several times that not only was Davion a cheater, but he was also very violent toward her.
Elizabeth wasn't just dealing with postpartum depression.
She would come into work crying all the time because of the things he did to her.
Lizzie said that Davion had been beating her.
Her co-workers say they've seen the evidence for themselves.
They tell a story of her coming to work with bruises.
She's been putting up with him for a long time.
We tried to help her, but she said she had to stay with him.
Lizzie tried to stay and endure the abuse for the sake of her children. She really didn't have anywhere to go or a way out. So she thought that if she just took it, things would get better.
But a horrific incident in December changed everything.
Around Christmas, Lizzie was getting ready to take a shower when Davion stormed in.
He grabbed her by her hair and tried to bend her over the sink to rape her.
After that, there was no going back.
For Lizzie, that was the final straw. She just realized that this was not going to get better for her or her children, and she had to make a change for their safety.
She and George had already been forging a relationship, so she went to George to ask if she could move in with him.
Elizabeth felt she'd finally managed to escape.
She got out of that toxic relationship and began a new relationship with George Little. Her life began picking up and looking brighter at that point.
But Davion began using the children to try to control her.
He wouldn't let her see them. He said that he was going to get full custody.
And he was fighting her attempt to get joint custody.
And eventually, she confided in her co-workers that Davion was stalking her.
She would say, "He always watches me. He sees me. He knows what I'm doing." And this made her coworkers very alarmed.
But most alarming of all is what Elizabeth told her boss 2 weeks before she disappeared.
She came into work and she was crying.
She wasn't sure what to do about it.
He said he's gonna kill me.
Police in Colorado Springs suspect that Elizabeth Kramer was strangled by someone close to her. And after talking to her coworkers, they believe they've identified the monster in her life. The father of her children, Davion Rogers.
Lizzie, about 2 weeks before she went missing, came into her supervisor's office and told her that Davion had threatened to kill her.
Elizabeth's boss told her to stay away, to keep her distance from Davion. But that was hard
because Davion had her children.
She just couldn't stay away from the kids, and eventually she went back so that she could see her children.
Detectives suspect that's what Davion was counting on.
The worst abuse most women will experience is when they're leaving the relationship. Because at that point, that partner that's doing the abuse, they no longer feel like they're in control.
And rather than give up control, detectives believe Davion had killed her. But they need evidence to prove it.
They had these incriminating statements from George and her coworkers about Davion, but nothing really substantial to back up those statements.
Until they received the records they'd requested from Davion's cell phone.
Once the subpoenas were returned, and police had the phone records and the social media records, police found out that Davion was still very much obsessed with Lizzie. He had directly threatened her, not only on text, but via social media.
But even more shocking is what the investigators find in his internet search history.
They found searches for how to get away with murder, how to get rid of a blood stain from a carpet.
He had been looking up things about black magic and how to use a voodoo doll to kill somebody, how to make strangulation look like an accident.
It wasn't just out of morbid curiosity. It was training.
Davion had watched several videos on how to do a rear naked chokehold, a martial arts maneuver that was consistent with the way in which Lizzie was murdered.
It's enough to convince detectives that Davion killed Elizabeth. But they need more evidence before they can make an arrest.
They already have a lot to go on, but what is really the nail in the coffin is the surveillance video.
Across the street from Davion's apartment is a public high school. And when detectives contact the staff, they learn that there's a security camera pointed right at their suspect's front door.
They're able to see that on Sunday evening, Lizzie did go over to Davion's apartment to pick up the children for dinner.
The footage from the surveillance cameras showed Elizabeth pulling up and parking, getting out of her car at 4:33 p.m.
She enters the apartment, but they do not see her come back out.
Instead, they see Davion.
He come out of his apartment, no signs of her. He gets in the car, moves it about 4 houses down.
After moving the car, he goes back inside the apartment.
Some time goes by and another black man shows up.
The other man brought a large item to the door, waited outside, and was then seen helping Davion carry it away from the apartment.
It looks like the bin that Elizabeth's body was found in.
At no point while police were watching the surveillance footage did they ever see Lizzie leave the apartment.
It's the proof the investigators have been looking for.
The police finally have enough evidence to charge Davion.
On June 17, 2020, police take Davion into custody at his apartment. They immediately conduct an interview, hoping to close the case with a confession.
They give him an opportunity to come clean and tell the truth. Davion denies that he had anything to do with Lizzie's murder.
Davion was sticking to his story. You know, he didn't change up anything.
So detectives decide it's time to lay all their cards on the table.
We didn't just bring you down here for no reason.
Okay. We got some new information in the case.
They tell Davion that they have the video, they have the internet searches, they have this evidence against him.
When they let him know, hey, you can't get out of this, he cracked.
He finally says he is ready to tell the truth.
She came over to pick up the kids like I said. But then something happened.
When Lizzie got there, he informed Lizzie that he did not trust her and did not want her to have the children.
They got into a heated argument about custody.
I can't take it anymore. I cannot take it.
They're getting into a shouting match.
And it quickly turned into more than just shouting.
He told her he was taking the kids and he was moving to Memphis.
He said it set Lizzie off, and she lunged at him.
She came at me. Like, she was trying to grab me.
And what'd you do?
I, pushed her off me.
But according to Davion, that wasn't the end of it.
Davion said that once he pushed Lizzie off of him, she grabbed a knife. She turned around and told him that if he was going to take the children, that she was going to kill all of them.
Davion says he had to protect himself.
I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let her cut me.
That's when he put her in the chokehold.
He really intended to just restrain her.
He didn't even realize he was choking her so hard.
He did not mean to kill her.
Armed with security camera video and their suspect's incriminating internet search history, Colorado Springs police have arrested Davion Rogers for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, Elizabeth Kramer. But now, under questioning, Davion has told them they have it all wrong.
Davion insists that he never intended to hurt Lizzie.
Davion said that Lizzie attacked him.
I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let her cut me.
In an attempt to defend himself, he puts her in a chokehold and didn't realize how hard he was squeezing.
Until he realized she was dead.
Davion told the detectives that he panicked. His first thought was to go outside and move the car.
It's crazy because all I could think was maybe if nobody knew she was there, it'd be okay.
But he also had to get rid of the body.
I need you to do me a favor, man.
Davion called one of his friends and had him go buy a 50-gallon tote and bring it to the house.
Did you tell him why you needed such a big tote?
No. No, sir. He had no idea about Lizzie being dead.
Davion had him stay outside and wait. While his friend was outside, he wrapped up Lizzie's body and stuffed it in the tote.
All this time, the kids were in the back room.
After putting her body in the tote, Davion asked his friend to help him carry it to her car.
You don't want to know what's in here. Don't even ask.
He insists that his friend had no idea and that he was just helping him.
When the tote was loaded into the car, Davion drove into the mountains outside Colorado Springs.
Davion had his friend stay behind with the children while he went to dispose of the body.
Davion's point of going into the mountains was looking for a place to dispose of the body.
Davion says that he drove to a spot where the road ran beside a cliff.
He backed the car up to the very edge.
Davion stated that he just kicked the bin over the people.
Then he drove back to Colorado Springs.
Davion abandoned Lizzie's car in Colorado Springs. He got a ride home and then started to clean up and get rid of anything that could have been potential evidence.
I wish it never happened. I mean, I wish she hadn't come at me like that.
Uh-huh.
I didn't want to hurt her.
The police are not really buying that. They know that it takes several minutes to strangle somebody.
It also doesn't fit with what investigators found in his internet search history.
They feel he was so upset that Lizzie was leaving him for George that he had already planned on killing her.
They end up charging him with first-degree murder.
When Davion goes on trial on February 25th, 2021, the prosecution tells the jury that the death of Lizzie Kramer was no accident.
This was premeditated. This is something that Davion had planned to do.
Prosecutors state that his motive in murdering her was the fact that Lizzie was leaving him for another man.
He doesn't want her to take his kids away from him and go start a new life with some other guy.
Davion refused to accept that their relationship was over. But nothing could persuade her to get back together with him.
Elizabeth was not going to go back to an abusive relationship no matter how hard he tried.
Davion has felt like if he couldn't have Lizzie, nobody could.
In the end, he decided she had to die.
This was done out of jealousy, out of him losing his sense of control over the relationship.
Prosecutors made it clear that this was not a crime of passion. Davion had spent several days searching and planning out how he was going to kill her.
By March 8th, he was ready.
When Elizabeth showed up to take her children to dinner, Davion took that opportunity while she was alone to end her life.
He knew he was going to commit this crime. He's prepared for it.
He struck without warning.
Davion caught her off guard as soon as she walked in, put her in the chokehold that he had been practicing.
He held it extremely tightly for several minutes.
Davion had plenty of time to realize what was happening, and still he did not loosen his grip.
It was deliberate and cold-blooded.
This all happened while the kids were playing in the back bedroom.
They're able to paint a pretty clear picture of Davion as a murderer and a monster.
The defense argues that Davion never intended to kill his ex-girlfriend.
He maintains that Lizzie left him no choice because she attacked him.
But the evidence is against him.
Davion had prepared this for months, and that's all recorded by his phone records, his computer records.
On September 9th, 2021, the jury reaches a decision.
They found Davion Rogers guilty of first-degree murder.
He was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
Davion Rogers is behind bars for life, and he will not ever be able to get out to inflict harm on anybody else.
Police, prosecutors, and family agree that justice has been served.
He had no remorse in it, so the sentence was well-deserved.
The murder, it was just so horrific, so cold-blooded, so callous.
Davion stole the mother of his children's life at the moment when she had finally found happiness.
Elizabeth had so much to look forward to. She was a happy, joyful person who had the opportunity with George to start a new life, and that was stolen from her.
Elizabeth wasn't deserving of the end that she found. Nobody deserves to be stuffed into a tote and kicked over the side of a cliff.
And Lizzie Kramer isn't the only victim.
Lizzie and Davion's kids, they've lost 2 parents.
It's just a tragic story all around.
The call came in just after sunset, at that hour when the sky over Palmdale turns a dull shade of grey, as if the day itself is reluctant to let go. There was nothing remarkable about the neighborhood: rows of modest homes, quiet streets, the faint hum of distant traffic, but something inside one of those houses had already gone terribly wrong long before anyone picked up the phone. When the dispatcher answered, the voice on the other end sounded controlled, almost rehearsed. A child wasn't breathing. No panic. No chaos spilling through the line. Just a statement, flat and cold, as if reporting something inconvenient rather than catastrophic. It was the kind of call that doesn't immediately raise alarms, but leaves behind a strange, lingering discomfort, like a note played just slightly off-key. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They moved quickly, efficiently, trained to expect the unexpected. But nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. Inside the house, the air felt heavy, stale, as though it had been sealed off from the outside world. The living room was dim, curtains drawn tight against the fading light. There were signs of life, furniture, scattered belongings, the faint smell of something cooked earlier in the day, but beneath it all was something else. Something wrong. Something that didn't belong in a place where a child lived. And then they saw him. A small body lay motionless on the floor, fragile in a way that felt almost unreal. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, if it could even be called breathing. One of the paramedics knelt beside him, instinctively reaching out, but hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not because they didn't know what to do, but because of what they saw. Bruises. Not just one or two, but everywhere. Layers of them, overlapping like shadows that refused to fade. Some were fresh, dark and angry against his skin. Others had already begun to yellow, evidence of injuries that had come and gone, unnoticed or ignored. There were marks that didn't look like accidents. Marks that told a story without words. Training kicked in. Airway, breathing, circulation. Hands moved quickly, voices sharp and focused. But even as they worked, there was an unspoken realization settling over the room. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't unexpected. This had been building for a long time. A stretcher was brought in. The boy was lifted carefully, as if he might break under the slightest pressure. Outside, the world carried on as usual. A car passed by. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Life continued, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in that small house. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked in silence, broken only by the occasional command or update. His pulse was weak. His breathing uneven. Every second felt like it stretched longer than it should, as if time itself was resisting what was about to happen. One of them glanced at the child's face. His eyes were closed, his expression eerily calm, as though he had already retreated somewhere far beyond reach. There was no sign of the struggle that must have come before. No visible fear. Just stillness. At the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed into action the moment the stretcher came through the doors. Bright lights replaced the dimness of the house. Voices overlapped. Equipment beeped and whirred. It was controlled chaos, the kind that exists on the edge of life and death. They did everything they could. But some damage runs too deep. Hours later, the noise faded. The urgency dissolved into silence. And just like that, it was over. An 8-year-old boy was gone. His name was Gabriel Fernandez. But the story didn't begin that night. It didn't begin with the phone call, or the ambulance, or the hospital. It began long before, in ways that were quieter, easier to overlook. It began with small things, moments that didn't seem important at the time. A bruise explained away. A story that didn't quite add up. A feeling, deep down, that something wasn't right. There were people who saw pieces of it. Teachers who noticed changes. Staff who heard things that didn't sit well. Reports that were filed, concerns that were raised. Each one like a flicker of light in the dark, trying to illuminate what was happening behind closed doors. But the lights never stayed on long enough. The system that was supposed to protect him failed, not all at once, but in fragments. A missed detail here. A delayed response there. decisions made with incomplete information. Assumptions that turned out to be wrong. It wasn't one mistake. It was many, layered together, until the weight of them became unbearable. And at the center of it all was a child who had no way out. In the days that followed his death, the details began to surface. Slowly at first, then all at once, like a flood breaking through a dam. The injuries. The conditions he had been living in. The things he had endured. People struggled to understand how something like this could happen. How a child could suffer so much for so long without being saved. The questions came quickly, sharp and relentless. Who was responsible? Who knew? Who should have known? But answers are rarely simple in cases like this. Because evil doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary doors, in ordinary neighborhoods, in lives that seem unremarkable from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't draw attention. It waits. And sometimes, the signs are there, but they are missed, misunderstood, or dismissed. What happened to Gabriel Fernandez wasn't a single act of violence. It was a pattern. A progression. A series of choices made over time, each one pushing things a little further, a little darker. By the time anyone realized just how far it had gone, it was already too late. But this story isn't just about what happened inside that house. It's about everything that surrounded it. It's about the people who were supposed to protect him, and why they didn't. It's about the system designed to intervene, and how it failed. It's about the warning signs that were seen, reported, documented, and still didn't lead to the outcome they should have. And most importantly, it's about a boy whose voice was never loud enough to be heard over the silence. As the investigation began, detectives stepped into a case that was already heavier than most. They weren't just looking at a death. They were looking at a life, one that had been shaped by fear, pain, and isolation. Every detail mattered. Every bruise, every report, every missed opportunity. Because somewhere in all of it was the truth. And the truth, once uncovered, would force everyone to confront something far more unsettling than a single crime. It would force them to ask how many chances there had been to stop it. And why none of them were enough. Palmdale, California, sits on the northern edge of Los Angeles County, where the city slowly gives way to stretches of desert and open sky. It is a place defined by contrasts. In the early morning, sunlight spills across quiet neighborhoods, illuminating rows of modest houses and neatly trimmed lawns. By afternoon, the heat settles in, heavy and unmoving, pressing down on the streets until everything feels slowed, almost suspended in time. From a distance, it looks like any other suburban community, a place where families build routines, where children ride bikes along sidewalks, where life unfolds in predictable rhythms. But like many places that appear ordinary, Palmdale carries stories that are less visible. Behind closed doors, beyond the reach of casual observation, lives unfold in ways that rarely make themselves known. It is in these unseen spaces that the foundations of tragedy are often laid, not in a single moment, but over time, through a series of quiet, unnoticed events. The house where Gabriel Fernandez would eventually live was not remarkable. It did not stand out from the others on the street. Its walls were plain, its windows no different from those of its neighbors. To anyone passing by, it was just another home, one of many, blending into the background of everyday life. There were no outward signs that anything inside was wrong. No visible cracks, no obvious neglect that would draw attention. It was, in every outward sense, unremarkable. And that is what made it so easy to overlook. Before Gabriel ever stepped into that house, his life had already been shaped by instability. Born on February 20, 2005, he entered a world that did not offer him the kind of consistent care most children rely on. His early years were not defined by a single home or a single routine. Instead, they were marked by movement, by changes in guardianship, by a sense of uncertainty that lingered beneath the surface. For a time, Gabriel lived with relatives, people who, by many accounts, tried to provide him with a sense of normalcy. In those years, there were glimpses of what his life could have been. He went to school, interacted with other children, experienced moments of safety and stability. These were not perfect circumstances, but they were enough to give him something many children in difficult situations lack: a sense of belonging, however fragile it may have been. He was described as a quiet child, but not withdrawn. There was a gentleness to him, a softness that showed in the way he interacted with others. He smiled easily, laughed when he felt comfortable, and sought out connection in the ways children naturally do. There were moments of light in his life, small but meaningful, that suggested a resilience beneath the surface. But that stability did not last. In 2012, everything changed. Gabriel's mother, Pearl Fernandez, regained custody of him. The decision, on paper, may have seemed like a step toward reunification, a mother reclaiming her role in her child's life. But reality is rarely as straightforward as it appears in legal documents. Behind that decision were complexities that would never be fully understood, choices that would carry consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated. When Gabriel moved into his mother's home, he entered a new environment, one that operated under a different set of rules. It was not just a change of address. It was a shift in the very structure of his daily life, in the people he depended on, in the sense of safety he had come to rely on. Pearl Fernandez was not alone. She lived with her boyfriend, Isoro Aguirre, a man whose presence would soon become central to Gabriel's life in ways no child should ever experience. To an outsider, their household may have seemed functional, even ordinary. There was no immediate indication of the darkness that would take root within those walls. But environments are shaped by more than appearances. From the outside, the neighborhood continued its quiet routine. Cars came and went. Neighbors greeted each other in passing. Children played in yards and along sidewalks, their laughter carrying through the warm air. It was the kind of place where life moved forward without much disruption, where people assumed that what they couldn't see was probably fine. Inside the house, however, the atmosphere was different. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when things began to change for Gabriel. There was no single turning point, no clear line separating before from after. Instead, the shift happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Small changes. Subtle differences in behavior. The kind of things that might not stand out unless someone was looking closely. But over time, those small changes began to accumulate. The routines that define childhood, school, meals, rest, started to take on a different meaning. What should have been sources of comfort became unpredictable. The sense of safety that children depend on began to erode, replaced by something harder to define, but impossible to ignore. For Gabriel, the world inside that house became increasingly isolated from the world outside. The two existed side by side, but they did not overlap in the ways they should have. At school, there were expectations, structures, people who watched and listened. At home, there was something else entirely, a reality that remained hidden from view, even as it began to leave marks that others would eventually notice. Palmdale itself continued unchanged. The sun rose and set. Days passed into weeks, weeks into months. Life moved forward, indifferent to what was unfolding behind one set of walls among thousands. But the setting matters, not because it caused what happened, but because it allowed it to remain unseen. In communities like this, there is often an unspoken trust in normalcy. People assume that what looks ordinary is ordinary. That a quiet house is a peaceful one. That a child walking to school is safe at home. These assumptions are not made out of negligence, but out of habit, out of the human tendency to believe that most things are as they appear. And most of the time, they are. But sometimes, they are not. As Gabriel adjusted to his new life, the contrast between what was visible and what was hidden grew sharper. The outside world offered glimpses of normalcy, classrooms, playgrounds, brief interactions that hinted at a different reality. But those glimpses were fleeting, overshadowed by what awaited him when he returned home. The house itself became a closed system, a place where the rules were controlled by the people inside it, where outside intervention was limited, inconsistent, and ultimately ineffective. It was within this space that patterns began to form, patterns that would later be examined in detail, dissected piece by piece in an attempt to understand how things had gone so far. But at the time, those patterns were not fully visible. They existed in fragments. A bruise noticed here. A comment made there. A report filed, then set aside. Each piece, on its own, might not have seemed enough to justify immediate action. But together, they formed a picture that was far more troubling than anyone initially realized. The setting of this story is not just a place. It is a combination of circumstances, environments, and systems that intersected in a way that allowed tragedy to unfold. It is a quiet street in Palmdale. It is a house that looked like every other house. It is a community that carried on, unaware of what was happening in its midst. And it is the invisible boundary between what is seen and what is hidden, a boundary that, in this case, was never crossed in time. As the days passed, Gabriel Fernandez continued to move between these two worlds, carrying with him the weight of experiences that no child should have to bear. To those who saw him briefly, he was just another student, another child in a classroom. But beneath that surface was a reality that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. The setting was in place. The pieces were already moving. And no one yet understood just how devastating the outcome would be, before his name became associated with courtrooms, headlines, and public outrage. Gabriel Fernandez was simply a child trying to find his place in the world. He was small for his age, with a quiet presence that often went unnoticed in crowded rooms, but there was something in his eyes that lingered, a softness, a searching quality, as if he was always looking for something just out of reach. In the years before everything changed, Gabriel's life held fragments of normalcy that, in hindsight, feel almost fragile. He spent time with relatives who tried, in their own ways, to give him structure. There were mornings when he woke up to familiar routines, the kind that anchor a child's sense of safety. Breakfast at the same table, voices that didn't carry tension, a sense that the day ahead was predictable. These moments weren't extraordinary, but for Gabriel, they mattered. He was the kind of child who didn't demand attention, but quietly hoped for it. At school, he blended into the background at first glance, but teachers who paid closer attention noticed small details. He was polite, often eager to please, the type of student who would follow instructions carefully, as if afraid of making mistakes. When spoken to, he would respond softly, sometimes hesitating, as though measuring his words before letting them out. There were glimpses of joy in him, though they often appeared in subtle ways. A brief smile when he understood something new. A moment of laughter shared with another child. These flashes of light didn't last long, but they revealed a side of him that hadn't yet been overshadowed by fear. Gabriel liked simple things. He enjoyed playing with toys that allowed him to imagine different worlds, places where he could create his own rules. In those moments, he wasn't defined by his circumstances. He was just a child, exploring, building, pretending. It was in these quiet activities that his resilience showed most clearly, not in grand gestures, but in the way he held onto small pieces of normal childhood despite everything. He also craved affection in ways that were easy to overlook. He would gravitate toward adults who showed him kindness, even in small amounts. A teacher who offered encouragement. A relative who listened. These connections, however brief, seemed to matter deeply to him. It was as if he was constantly searching for reassurance, for proof that he was seen and valued. But alongside these moments was something harder to define. Even before the worst of his suffering began, there were signs that Gabriel carried a weight that other children his age did not. It showed in the way he sometimes withdrew, his gaze drifting away as if lost in thought. It showed in the hesitation, before he answered certain questions, in the way he seemed to brace himself for reactions that hadn't yet come. Children often express their inner worlds in indirect ways, and Gabriel was no different. There were times when he would say things that didn't fully make sense to those around him, fragments of thoughts that hinted at something deeper. Not enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough to create a subtle unease. As he grew older, that unease became more noticeable. When Gabriel moved back in with his mother, the shift in his demeanor did not happen overnight. It was gradual, unfolding over weeks and months. At first, the changes were small. A little quieter than before. A little more reserved. The kind of differences that could easily be attributed to adjustment, to the natural challenges of moving into a new home. But then the changes deepened. At school, teachers began to notice that Gabriel seemed more withdrawn. He still followed instructions, still tried to meet expectations, but there was a new layer to his behavior, a tension that hadn't been there before. He flinched more easily. His eyes darted toward the door at unexpected moments, as if anticipating something. The smiles became less frequent. When they did appear, they often seemed fleeting, like something that surfaced out of habit rather than genuine feeling. It was as though he was trying to maintain a version of himself that no longer matched what he was experiencing. Physical signs began to appear as well. At first, they were easy to explain. A bruise here. A scratch there. Children get hurt. They fall, they play, they bump into things. These are normal parts of childhood, and they rarely raise concern on their own. But Gabriel's injuries did not follow a typical pattern. They appeared more often, in places that were harder to dismiss. Arms, face, torso. Some were fresh, others fading, creating a timeline of harm that stretched across days and weeks. When asked about them, his answers were inconsistent, sometimes vague, sometimes clearly rehearsed. He would say he fell. That he hurt himself playing. That it was nothing. But his body told a different story. There was also the way he carried himself. A stiffness in his movements, as if certain motions caused pain. A carefulness, like he was constantly aware of his own body in a way children rarely are. These details didn't always stand out individually, but together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Emotionally, Gabriel seemed to exist in a state of quiet fear. He didn't always express it directly, but it was there, in the way he hesitated to speak, in the way he watched adults closely, as if trying to gauge their reactions before deciding how to behave. It was a kind of vigilance that doesn't develop without reason. There were moments when the fear broke through more clearly. Times when he confided in teachers, his words hesitant but urgent. He spoke about being hurt, about not wanting to go home. These weren't dramatic declarations. They were simple statements, delivered in a way that suggested he didn't fully expect to be believed, but needed to say them anyway. And yet, even in those moments, there was restraint. Gabriel didn't reveal everything. He couldn't. Whether it was fear, confusion, or a learned instinct to protect himself, he held back. What he shared was only a glimpse, a partial view of a reality that was far more severe than anyone fully understood at the time. Despite everything, there were still traces of the child he had once been. He continued to show kindness in small ways. He followed rules. He tried to meet expectations. These behaviors, rather than signaling that he was okay, reflected something else entirely, a deep need to avoid conflict, to minimize risk, to navigate his environment as safely as possible. It was survival, expressed through obedience. To those who saw him only briefly, Gabriel might have seemed like a quiet, well-behaved child. But to those who looked closer, there was something else, a disconnect between his outward behavior and the subtle signs of distress beneath it. His story, at this stage, was not yet fully visible. It existed in pieces, scattered across interactions, observations, and reports. Each piece held part of the truth, but none of them, on their own, revealed the full extent of what he was experiencing. Gabriel Fernandez was more than the injuries that would later define his case. He was a child who sought connection, who responded to kindness, who tried to adapt to circumstances far beyond his control. He carried within him both vulnerability and resilience, a combination that made his situation all the more tragic. Because even as the signs became clearer, even as the pattern of harm continued to unfold, he remained in the same environment, exposed to the same dangers. And the parts of his story that mattered most, the ones that could have led to intervention, to protection, to a different outcome, were still not being fully seen. There was no single moment when everything suddenly became unbearable. No loud, unmistakable breaking point that announced itself to the outside world. What happened inside that house unfolded in layers, slowly tightening around Gabriel Fernandez, until there was no space left for him to escape, not even in the smallest sense. At first, the punishment came in ways that could still be disguised, explained away if anyone asked too many questions. A slap that left no lasting mark. A shove that could be blamed on clumsiness. But even in those early moments, there was something different in the intent behind the actions. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't anger that flared and faded. It was something colder, more deliberate, something that lingered long after the act itself was over. As days turned into weeks, the line between punishment and cruelty disappeared entirely. Gabriel learned quickly that there were no safe boundaries, no predictable limits to what might happen next. The rules of his world shifted constantly, controlled entirely by the moods and impulses of the adults around him. What was acceptable one moment could become a reason for punishment the next. A glance held too long. A response that came too slowly. Even silence could be interpreted as defiance. Inside the house, time seemed to stretch in a way that made everything feel endless. Mornings didn't bring relief. Nights didn't offer rest. Each day blended into the next, marked not by routines of comfort, but by cycles of fear and anticipation. Gabriel existed in a state of constant alertness, his body and mind adjusting to survive in an environment where safety was never guaranteed. The physical abuse escalated gradually, but relentlessly. There were beatings that left visible marks, and others that didn't. Objects were used when hands weren't enough. The force behind each strike carried intention, a need not just to punish, but to dominate, to control. Bruises formed in places that clothing couldn't always hide. Some faded over time, replaced by new ones before the old had fully healed. But the pain wasn't limited to what could be seen. Gabriel was often deprived of basic necessities. Food became something uncertain, withheld or given in ways that stripped away any sense of normalcy. Hunger settled into him, not as a temporary discomfort, but as a constant presence, something he learned to live with because he had no other choice. There were moments when even the act of eating became part of the punishment. He was forced to consume things no child should ever be made to eat, acts that blurred the line between physical abuse and psychological torment. These weren't impulsive decisions. They were calculated, designed to degrade, to strip away dignity in ways that left deeper scars than any visible injury. Isolation became another tool. Gabriel was confined to small spaces for extended periods, cut off from any sense of the outside world. Closets, cabinets, areas where light barely reached. In those moments, time lost its meaning entirely. There were no distractions, no comfort, no escape from the thoughts that filled the silence. The darkness wasn't just physical. It seeped into everything. Even when he was allowed out, the sense of confinement remained. The house itself became a kind of prison, each room carrying the memory of what had happened there before. There was no place within those walls that felt safe, no corner where he could let his guard down. The abuse wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it came in the form of quiet threats, words delivered in low tones that carried more weight than shouting ever could. Gabriel learned to read these signals, to recognize the subtle shifts in mood that indicated danger. It was a skill no child should ever have to develop, but for him, it became essential. And yet, despite everything, he continued to go to school. Each morning, he stepped out of that house and into a different world, one that operated under entirely different rules. For a few hours, he was surrounded by people who spoke to him with normalcy, who expected him to learn, to participate, to exist as a child rather than as a target. But the transition between those two worlds came at a cost. The signs of what he endured didn't stay hidden. They followed him into the classroom, written across his body, reflected in his behavior. Teachers began to notice more than just the physical injuries. They saw the way he hesitated before sitting down, as if bracing himself against pain. The way he moved carefully, avoiding sudden motions. The way his eyes seemed to search the room constantly, never fully at ease. There were days when he appeared exhausted, his energy drained in a way that went beyond typical childhood fatigue. Concentration became difficult. Simple tasks required more effort. It was as if his mind was divided, part of it trying to focus on the lesson, the other part still anchored in the reality he had left behind that morning. And sometimes, the truth slipped through. In quiet moments, when the distance between his two worlds felt too great to maintain, Gabriel spoke. Not in long, detailed explanations, but in fragments. He mentioned being hurt. He expressed fear about going home. These statements were often brief, delivered with hesitation, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Yet even then, there was restraint. He didn't reveal everything. He couldn't. Whether it was fear of what might happen if he said too much, or a lack of understanding about how to fully articulate his experiences, he held back. What he shared was enough to raise concern, but not enough to paint a complete picture. Back at the house, the cycle continued. Punishments became more severe, more unpredictable. The line between control and cruelty disappeared entirely. There were moments when the violence escalated suddenly, triggered by something small or seemingly insignificant. Other times, it felt premeditated, as if decisions had been made long before the act itself took place. Gabriel's world narrowed further with each passing day. The opportunities for escape, physical or emotional, became fewer. The connections he had outside the house, the ones that offered brief glimpses of safety, were not enough to counterbalance what he faced within it. They were moments of relief, but they did not change his circumstances. And still, the pattern went on. Each day added to the last, building a history of harm that grew heavier, more complex, more difficult to fully comprehend from the outside. To anyone looking in without context, it might have seemed fragmented, isolated incidents, disconnected observations. But inside that house, it was continuous. Relentless. By the time May 2013 arrived, the situation had already reached a point where the damage was no longer just physical or emotional. It had become something deeper, something that threatened the very foundation of Gabriel's ability to survive. The final events did not come out of nowhere. They were the culmination of everything that had come before. Each act of violence, each moment of neglect, each decision that allowed the pattern to continue had led to that point. It was not a sudden explosion, but the inevitable result of a system that had been breaking down for months. And when it happened, when the violence reached its peak, there was no one there to stop it. No interruption. No intervention. Only the silence of a house that had held too many secrets for far too long. By the time emergency responders stepped fully into the house, the situation had already crossed an invisible threshold. What they were seeing was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. It was a question of how much had already been lost. The boy's body told a story before anyone asked a single question. Under the artificial light, every detail became impossible to ignore. The bruises were not random. They were layered, overlapping in a way that suggested repetition, not accident. Some marks were deep and dark, others faint and fading, creating a map of injuries that stretched across time. There were burns, distinct in shape, suggesting contact with something heated rather than incidental exposure. His ribs showed signs of trauma. His face, though still, carried subtle swelling, the kind that comes from repeated impact. One of the paramedics, trained to remain composed in even the worst situations, felt a moment of stillness settle in his chest. It wasn't hesitation. It was recognition. This wasn't just an emergency. This was a crime. They moved anyway, because training leaves no room for pause. Oxygen was administered. Vital signs were checked again and again, as if repetition alone could stabilize what was already slipping away. His pulse was erratic. His breathing shallow, barely sustained. Every movement was careful, deliberate, as though even the act of trying to save him carried the risk of causing further harm. The adults in the house remained nearby, but something about their presence felt disconnected from the urgency of the moment. Their explanations came in fragments, offered without the kind of emotion that usually accompanies a situation like this. There were claims of accidents, of falls, of things that happen when children are careless. But the evidence on the floor didn't align with those words. Not even close. The paramedics didn't argue. That wasn't their role. Their focus remained on the child, on doing everything possible in the limited time they had. But in the back of their minds, a separate process had already begun. Observations were being catalogued, details noted without being spoken aloud. Years of experience had taught them what certain patterns meant. And this pattern was unmistakable. When they lifted Gabriel onto the stretcher, his body felt lighter than expected. Not just because of his age, but because of what had been taken from him over time. There was a fragility to him that went beyond physical size. It was the kind of fragility that comes from prolonged neglect, from a body pushed past its limits again and again. Outside, the evening air felt cooler, sharper, as if the world beyond the house operated under entirely different conditions. Neighbors had begun to notice the activity. A few stood at a distance, watching in silence, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Emergency vehicles have a way of drawing attention, but there was something about this scene that held people in place a little longer than usual. The ambulance doors closed, sealing Gabriel inside with the paramedics and their urgency. As the vehicle pulled away, sirens cutting through the quiet neighborhood, the house receded into the background. But what had happened inside it did not. At the hospital, the transition was immediate. Bright lights replaced dim shadows. Voices multiplied. Hands reached in from every direction, each one trained, each one moving with purpose. Gabriel was transferred from stretcher to bed in a single fluid motion, surrounded instantly by medical staff who understood, within seconds, the severity of what they were dealing with. The room filled with controlled intensity. Monitors were connected. Numbers appeared, fluctuating in ways that told their own story. Doctors issued instructions quickly, their focus narrowing to the essential. There was no time to process the broader context, no space for questions about how or why. Those would come later. Right now, the only objective was survival. But even as they worked, the signs were clear. The injuries were extensive. Not isolated. Not recent alone. They spoke of repeated trauma, of a body that had been under assault for far longer than anyone in that room had been aware. Internal damage compounded external wounds. Swelling in the brain. Fractures that had begun to heal alongside newer breaks. This wasn't a single event. It was a history. One of the nurses, while assisting with the procedure, found herself glancing at Gabriel's face more than once. There was something about the stillness, the way his expression had settled into something almost peaceful despite everything his body showed. It created a dissonance that was difficult to reconcile. Children aren't supposed to look like this. Time moved differently in that room. Minutes stretched, each one carrying weight. Every intervention was measured against a rapidly narrowing window. The medical team worked with precision, but beneath it all was an understanding that some outcomes cannot be reversed, no matter how quickly or skillfully one responds. Eventually, the pace slowed. Not because the work was done, but because there was nothing left to do. The shift from action to stillness was subtle at first, then absolute. The monitors that had once demanded constant attention became quiet. The voices that had filled the room faded into silence. And in that silence, the reality settled in. Gabriel Fernandez was gone. For a moment, no one spoke. Then procedures resumed, but in a different tone. Documentation replaced urgency. Observations were recorded carefully, each detail noted with precision. Because what had just happened was no longer only a medical event. It was evidence. Outside the room, word began to spread through the hospital staff. Not loudly, not formally, but in the quiet way information moves among people who recognize the gravity of a situation. There was a shared understanding, unspoken but clear, that this case would not end here. Back at the house, law enforcement had already begun to secure the scene. The shift from emergency response to investigation happened quickly, almost seamlessly. Where paramedics had focused on saving a life, detectives now focused on understanding its end. The environment that had once been part of an urgent rescue became a space to be examined, documented, preserved. Every room held potential answers. The lighting was adjusted. Photographs were taken from multiple angles, capturing details that might not seem significant at first glance. Surfaces were inspected. Objects noted. Nothing was too small to consider, because in cases like this, the smallest detail can change everything. There were signs of normal life scattered throughout the house, furniture, personal items, the remnants of daily routines. But beneath that surface, there were inconsistencies. Areas that didn't align with the image of a typical household. Objects that suggested patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. The investigation didn't begin with conclusions. It began with questions. How long had this been happening? Who was responsible? And perhaps most importantly, who knew? As detectives moved through the space, they weren't just looking for physical evidence. They were reconstructing a timeline, piece by piece, trying to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to continue. Because what lay before them was not the result of a single moment. It was the endpoint of something much larger. And somewhere within that house, within those walls that had kept their secrets for so long, were the answers they needed to uncover the truth. In the days that followed Gabriel Fernandez's death, the investigation widened quickly, but clarity did not come with it. Instead, what emerged first was a tangle of contradictions, half-truths, and explanations that seemed designed to hold together only under the lightest scrutiny. Detectives began with the most immediate question, what had happened inside that house, but the answers they received were anything but straightforward. The adults at the center of the case offered versions of events that shifted depending on when and how they were asked. At times, their stories aligned in broad strokes, describing accidents, falls, moments of misfortune that had somehow compounded into tragedy. But the details never held steady. Timelines overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. Injuries that clearly occurred at different stages of healing were described as the result of a single incident. The more investigators listened, the more the narrative unraveled. There was something calculated in the way those explanations were delivered. Not overtly rehearsed, but shaped, adjusted in real time, as though each answer was being tested for plausibility even as it was spoken. Detectives recognized this pattern. It wasn't uncommon in cases where the truth was being obscured, where those involved believed that consistency alone might be enough to create doubt. But consistency, without substance, only goes so far. The physical evidence had already set the tone. The medical findings from the hospital left little room for interpretation. This was not an accidental death. It was the result of prolonged, repeated trauma. That reality anchored the investigation, even as other elements remained unclear. Still, identifying responsibility required more than recognizing harm. It required building a case that could withstand scrutiny, one that accounted for every detail, every contradiction, every possible explanation. And that meant looking beyond the immediate scene. Detectives began to trace Gabriel's recent history, moving outward from the house into the systems and spaces he had occupied in the months before his death. School records were among the first to be reviewed, and what they revealed added a new layer of complexity. Teachers had noticed changes in Gabriel long before the final incident. Reports described a child who arrived at school with visible injuries, whose explanations often didn't match the severity or pattern of those injuries. There were notes about bruises, about behavioral shifts, about moments when Gabriel expressed fear of going home. These observations had not gone unrecorded. They had been documented, passed along through the appropriate channels. That led investigators to the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services. The agency's involvement introduced a different kind of challenge. Unlike physical evidence, which could be observed directly, this part of the case relied on records, decisions, and actions taken over time. Detectives requested files, and when those files were reviewed, a pattern began to emerge, one that was both revealing and deeply troubling. There had been multiple reports concerning Gabriel's well-being. Each report represented a moment when someone had recognized that something might be wrong. A teacher, a staff member, someone who had seen enough to feel concern. These reports triggered responses, as they were designed to do. Social workers had been assigned. Visits had been conducted. Assessments had been made. On paper, the system had functioned. But the outcome told a different story. As detectives examined the records, they found gaps. Not always obvious ones, but significant nonetheless. Visits that were brief. Conclusions that seemed to rely heavily on surface observations. Statements taken at face value without deeper verification. There were instances where Gabriel's own words, his expressions of fear, were noted but not fully acted upon. Each decision, taken individually, might have seemed reasonable within its context. But viewed together, they painted a picture of missed opportunities, moments where a different choice might have altered the course of events. This realization complicated the investigation. Because while the primary focus remained on the individuals directly responsible for Gabriel's abuse, it became increasingly clear that the circumstances surrounding the case were broader than a single household. There were layers of involvement, degrees of responsibility that extended beyond the immediate perpetrators. At the same time, detectives faced more traditional investigative challenges. They needed to establish a clear timeline of events leading up to Gabriel's death. That meant reconciling conflicting statements, verifying alibis, and determining exactly when and how the fatal injuries had been inflicted. Each piece of information had to be tested against the others, checked for consistency, measured against the physical evidence. Neighbors were interviewed, though their contributions were limited. Most described the household as quiet, unremarkable. There had been no obvious disturbances, no events that stood out as cause for concern. This absence of external indicators reinforced what investigators already suspected: the abuse had been contained, hidden within the walls of the home. Other individuals connected to the family were also questioned. Some provided insights into the dynamics within the household, though these accounts varied in reliability. Relationships are complex, and perceptions are often shaped by personal experiences. Detectives had to sift through these perspectives carefully, separating what could be corroborated from what remained subjective. Meanwhile, the inconsistencies in the suspects' statements continued to draw attention. Small details began to take on greater significance. The timing of certain events. The explanation for specific injuries. The way each person described Gabriel's behavior in the days leading up to his death. These elements, when examined closely, revealed patterns that were difficult to ignore. There was a growing sense that the truth was not being hidden behind a single lie, but behind many. Each incomplete answer, each contradiction, each omission added to a larger structure that investigators were slowly dismantling. It was a process that required patience, precision, and an understanding that breakthroughs often come not from dramatic revelations, but from the accumulation of small, consistent findings. Still, progress was not immediate. There were moments when the case seemed to stall, when the available information led in multiple directions without clearly converging. These were the moments when doubt could begin to surface, when the complexity of the situation threatened to obscure the central objective. But the evidence remained. It did not change. It did not adapt. It existed as a constant reference point, grounding the investigation even when other elements became uncertain. As more information was gathered, the focus began to narrow. The patterns of behavior, the physical evidence, the inconsistencies in the accounts, all of these factors pointed in specific directions. The challenge was no longer identifying whether a crime had occurred, but establishing the precise roles of those involved, understanding how the events had unfolded in detail. At the same time, the broader implications of the case continued to take shape. It was no longer just about what had happened to Gabriel, but about how it had been allowed to happen. The investigation was revealing not only individual actions, but systemic vulnerabilities, points where intervention had been possible, but did not occur. These revelations added weight to the case, because they suggested that the responsibility did not exist in isolation. It was interconnected, spanning individuals, institutions, and decisions made over time. As detectives moved forward, they carried this understanding with them. Each new piece of evidence, each clarified detail, brought them closer to a comprehensive picture. But it also raised new questions, deeper ones, about accountability and prevention. The case was no longer just about solving a crime. It was about confronting the full scope of what that crime represented. And that scope was larger, more complex, and more unsettling than it had first appeared. The turning point in the investigation did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It did not come with a confession shouted across an interrogation table, or a piece of evidence so undeniable that it instantly resolved every question. Instead, it emerged slowly, almost quietly, as fragments of truth began to align in a way that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. By this stage, detectives had already gathered enough to understand the scale of what had happened. The medical findings alone had eliminated any possibility of accident. The injuries were too numerous, too varied, too consistent with repeated trauma inflicted over time. But understanding that a crime had occurred was only the beginning. The challenge was proving, with precision, who was responsible and how the events had unfolded in their final, irreversible form. The breakthrough came from convergence. It was not one piece of evidence, but many, layered together until they formed a pattern that held under scrutiny. Medical reports, witness statements, timelines, and behavioral analysis all began to point in the same direction. Each element reinforced the others, reducing the space for alternative explanations until there was almost none left. One of the most significant shifts occurred when investigators revisited the timeline of Gabriel's final days. Initially, the accounts provided by the adults in the house had created a blurred sequence of events. Times were approximate. Actions were described in vague terms. There was an attempt to compress what had happened into a narrower window, to suggest that the fatal injuries were the result of a sudden, isolated incident. But the medical evidence contradicted that narrative. Experts were brought in to analyze the injuries in detail, not just to determine cause of death, but to establish when specific traumas had occurred. Their findings introduced a level of clarity that the investigation had previously lacked. Certain injuries were identified as recent, inflicted within a critical time frame. Others showed signs of healing, indicating they had occurred days or even weeks earlier. This created a layered timeline, one that extended beyond the narrow scope initially described. When this timeline was compared against the statements given by the suspects, the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Events that were claimed to have happened at one time could not account for injuries that clearly predated or postdated those moments. The narrative began to fracture under its own weight. At the same time, investigators focused more closely on behavioral patterns. The dynamics within the household were examined not just through statements, but through the lens of known patterns in cases involving prolonged abuse. Control, escalation, isolation, these were not random elements. They followed recognizable trajectories, ones that could be mapped against the evidence already collected. What emerged was a clearer picture of intent. This was not a situation where harm had occurred impulsively, in a moment of uncontrolled anger. The pattern suggested something more sustained, more deliberate. The repetition of injuries, the nature of the punishments, the methods used, all pointed to a system of control that had been maintained over time. This understanding narrowed the focus of the investigation significantly. Attention centered on the individuals who had both the opportunity and the consistent presence required to carry out such actions. Their roles within the household, their interactions with Gabriel, and their explanations of events were examined in greater detail. Interrogations became more targeted. Rather than asking broad questions, detectives began to present specific inconsistencies, placing the suspects in positions where they had to reconcile their statements with established facts. This shift in approach created pressure, not through aggression, but through precision. Small cracks began to appear. Details that had previously been overlooked or explained away became points of contention. One account would contradict another. A timeline would shift slightly, then shift again. These were not dramatic collapses, but incremental changes that revealed the instability of the narrative being maintained. At the same time, additional testimonies reinforced the emerging picture. Individuals outside the immediate household, including teachers and staff who had interacted with Gabriel, provided accounts that added depth to the timeline. Their observations, when aligned with the medical findings, created a continuity that extended from the classroom to the home. This continuity was critical. It demonstrated that the abuse was not confined to a single moment or event. It was ongoing, visible in different contexts, leaving traces that connected one setting to another. The injuries seen at school, the behaviors observed, the reports filed, all of these elements now fit within a larger, coherent framework. The breakthrough was not just about identifying what had happened. It was about removing ambiguity. Each new piece of evidence reduced the number of possible interpretations, until the remaining explanation was not just plausible, but inevitable. The narrative that had been constructed by the suspects could no longer withstand the weight of the facts. Investigators also revisited the physical environment with this new clarity. What had once been a general examination of the scene became more focused. Specific areas of the house were reanalyzed in light of the established timeline. Objects that had been noted but not fully understood took on new significance when placed within the context of repeated abuse. This process revealed patterns in the environment itself. Spaces that had likely been used for confinement. Items that could have been used to inflict harm. The layout of the house, once neutral, now appeared as part of the system that had enabled the abuse to continue. Every detail contributed to the larger picture. As the case solidified, the role of intent became increasingly central. Proving that harm occurred was not enough. The legal threshold required demonstrating that the actions were deliberate, that they were carried out with an understanding of their consequences. The evidence, when viewed collectively, supported this conclusion. The nature of the injuries, the duration of the abuse, the attempts to explain or conceal what had happened, all pointed to a level of awareness that went beyond negligence. This was not accidental. It was sustained. And it was preventable. The final element of the breakthrough came from the alignment of all these factors into a cohesive case. Medical evidence established the timeline and cause of death. Witness statements provided context and continuity. Behavioral analysis clarified intent. Physical evidence supported the mechanisms of harm. Together, they formed a structure that was both comprehensive and resistant to contradiction. At this point, the investigation shifted from discovery to confirmation. Detectives were no longer searching for what had happened. They were preparing to present it, to ensure that every element was documented, every detail accounted for, every connection clearly established. The ambiguity that had once surrounded the case was gone. In its place was a narrative built not on assumptions, but on evidence. And that narrative pointed directly to those responsible. The turning point had been reached, not through a single moment of revelation, but through the steady accumulation of truth. It was the kind of breakthrough that does not announce itself loudly, but changes everything nonetheless. Because once the pieces fell into place, there was no longer any question of what had happened. Only the question of what would come next. The courtroom did not feel like the end of a story. It felt like the weight of everything that had come before pressing into a single space, where every word, every image, every piece of evidence would be forced into the open. The air inside was still, heavy with anticipation, as if even the walls understood what was about to unfold. When the proceedings began, there was no dramatic shift in atmosphere, no sudden moment that marked the transition from investigation to judgment. Instead, it moved forward with a kind of quiet inevitability. The case had already been built piece by piece, assembled through months of work. Now, it would be laid out in full view, examined not just by those directly involved, but by a jury tasked with understanding the unthinkable. The prosecution did not begin with conclusions. They began with Gabriel. They spoke of him not as a case, not as a collection of evidence, but as a child. They described his life in fragments, reconstructing it through the testimonies of those who had known him, however briefly. Teachers spoke of a quiet boy who tried to follow the rules, who showed signs of fear that grew more pronounced over time. Their voices carried a kind of restraint, as if even now, they were careful not to overstep, not to assume more than they had seen. But what they had seen was enough. Photographs were introduced, and with them, the room shifted. There is a difference between hearing about injuries and seeing them. Words can create distance. Images remove it. The photographs were not presented all at once. They were shown carefully, methodically, each one tied to a specific point in the timeline. Bruises, burns, fractures, evidence of harm that had not occurred in a single moment, but over time, accumulating until the body could no longer withstand it. Some members of the jury looked directly at the images, forcing themselves to absorb what was being shown. Others glanced briefly, then looked away, their expressions tightening. There was no neutral reaction. The evidence demanded a response, whether it was visible or not. Medical experts followed, translating what could be seen into what it meant. They explained the injuries not just in terms of their severity, but their progression. How certain wounds indicated repeated trauma. How the body responds to ongoing harm. How healing and injury can exist simultaneously, creating a record that is as much about time as it is about impact. Their testimony was clinical, precise, grounded in science. But beneath that precision was something else, a recognition of what those findings represented. This was not an abstract case. It was a child whose body had become a record of sustained abuse. The defense approached the case from a different angle. They did not deny that Gabriel had been injured. That much was impossible. Instead, they focused on intent, on responsibility, on the complexities of what had occurred within that house. They questioned timelines, suggested alternative interpretations of events, pointed to inconsistencies in witness statements. Their arguments were measured, deliberate. They emphasized doubt, because doubt is the foundation of defense. If enough uncertainty could be introduced, if enough questions could remain unanswered, it might be enough to alter the outcome. But the challenge they faced was the consistency of the evidence. Each attempt to isolate a detail, to reinterpret a moment, had to contend with the larger framework that had been established. The injuries were not isolated. The timeline was not fragmented. The patterns were not ambiguous. They formed a structure that was difficult to dismantle without addressing the whole. As the trial progressed, the focus shifted increasingly toward the actions of the defendants. Their presence in the courtroom was constant, but their demeanor did not always align with the gravity of the situation. There were moments when their expressions remained neutral, detached in ways that stood in contrast to the testimony being presented. Other times, there were subtle reactions, brief shifts in posture, small changes in expression, that suggested an awareness of how the evidence was being received. When they spoke, their words were carefully chosen. Statements were given, explanations offered, but they did not fully resolve the contradictions that had been identified during the investigation. Instead, they often introduced new layers of complexity, details that required further interpretation, further analysis. The prosecution returned, again and again, to the central theme of the case. This was not an accident. They reinforced this through repetition, through the consistent presentation of evidence that supported that conclusion. Each witness, each document, each photograph contributed to the same narrative. It was not built on a single point, but on many, each one reinforcing the others. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the pace shifted. The presentation of evidence gave way to arguments, the structured delivery of facts replaced by interpretation. Both sides addressed the jury directly, asking them to consider not just what had been shown, but what it meant. The prosecution spoke of responsibility. They emphasized the duration of the abuse, the opportunities for intervention that had not been taken, the deliberate nature of the actions that had led to Gabriel's death. They asked the jury to look at the totality of the evidence, to see it not as separate pieces, but as a cohesive whole. The defense focused on uncertainty. They pointed to the complexities, the areas where absolute clarity was difficult to achieve. They reminded the jury of the standard they were required to meet, the level of certainty necessary to reach a verdict. And then, the decision was no longer in the hands of the attorneys. It belonged to the jury. Deliberation is a quiet process, but it carries immense weight. Behind closed doors, the evidence is revisited, the arguments reconsidered, the details examined once more. It is a space where interpretation becomes decision, where the abstract becomes final. When the jury returned, the room felt different. Not louder, not more intense, but more focused. Every movement, every word carried significance. The verdict was not delivered with dramatic emphasis. It was read plainly, as required. But the impact of those words extended far beyond their tone. Guilty. The conclusion was definitive. It reflected not just a moment, but the accumulation of everything that had been presented. The evidence, the testimony, the arguments, all of it had led to this point. Sentencing followed, introducing another layer to the process. The court considered not only the actions that had been proven, but their severity, their implications. The legal system, bound by its structures and guidelines, moved toward a resolution that sought to match the gravity of the crime. For one defendant, the sentence carried the highest level of punishment available. For the other, it meant a life defined by confinement, with no expectation of release. These decisions were not made lightly. They were the result of a process designed to weigh every factor, to ensure that the outcome reflected both the evidence and the law. But even as the sentences were delivered, there was an understanding that justice, in this context, was not about restoration. Nothing could restore what had been lost. The courtroom slowly emptied after the proceedings concluded. People left in silence, their thoughts carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. For some, it was a sense of closure. For others, it was something more complicated, a recognition that while the legal process had reached its end, the questions raised by the case would not disappear so easily. Because the trial had answered one set of questions. It had established what happened, who was responsible, and what the consequences would be. But beyond those answers, there remained something else. A deeper question, one that extended beyond the individuals in the courtroom. How had it come to this? And what, if anything, could have been done to stop it before it reached this point? After the verdict, the silence did not feel like closure. It felt like an echo, something that lingered long after the voices in the courtroom had faded. The legal process had done what it was designed to do. It had examined evidence, weighed testimony, and delivered judgment. But outside the structure of the courtroom, the story of Gabriel Fernandez refused to settle into something as simple as an ending. In the days that followed, his name spread far beyond Palmdale. It moved through news reports, conversations, and public discourse, carried by a sense of collective disbelief. People who had never met him, who had never seen the street he lived on, began to grapple with the same question: how could this have happened? The question did not come from a place of curiosity. It came from discomfort. Because the details of the case did not fit neatly into the idea of an isolated tragedy. They pointed to something broader, something embedded within systems that were supposed to protect, to intervene, to recognize when a child was in danger. The focus shifted, gradually but inevitably, from the individuals who had been convicted to the structures that had surrounded the case. Attention turned toward the reports that had been filed before Gabriel's death. The documented concerns. The moments when teachers, staff, and others had recognized that something was wrong. These were not hypothetical scenarios. They were real instances, recorded and acknowledged. And yet, they had not led to the outcome they should have. This realization created a different kind of response, one that was less about anger directed at specific individuals and more about a broader sense of failure. It was not as immediate, or as easily defined, but it was just as powerful. Public discussions began to examine the role of child protective services, not in abstract terms, but in the context of this specific case. The Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services became a focal point, its actions scrutinized in detail. Records were reviewed again, not by investigators seeking to build a case, but by a public trying to understand what had gone wrong. What emerged was not a simple narrative. There were policies, procedures, guidelines, all designed to identify and respond to situations exactly like this. There were professionals trained to assess risk, to make decisions based on available information. But between those frameworks and the reality of what had happened, there was a gap. That gap became the center of the conversation. Some argued that the system had been overwhelmed, that high caseloads and limited resources made it difficult to respond effectively in every situation. Others pointed to specific decisions, moments where different choices might have led to different outcomes. The discussion was not unified, but it was persistent. Because the stakes were clear. This was not about assigning blame after the fact. It was about understanding how to prevent something similar from happening again. For those who had known Gabriel, even briefly, the aftermath was deeply personal. Teachers who had interacted with him carried the weight of their observations in a different way now. Moments that had once seemed uncertain, difficult to interpret, took on new clarity in hindsight. The things he had said, the way he had behaved, the signs he had shown, they were no longer fragments. They were part of a larger story that had ended in a way no one had wanted. There is a particular kind of reflection that comes after events like this. It is not just about what was seen, but about what was understood at the time. About the limits of perception, the challenges of interpreting incomplete information. For those who had tried to help, who had raised concerns, there was a tension between knowing they had acted and wondering if more could have been done. This tension does not resolve easily. It lingers. In the community, the house where Gabriel had lived became something different. It was no longer just another home on a quiet street. It carried a history that could not be separated from its physical presence. People passed by it with a different awareness, a recognition that something profound had occurred there. But even as attention focused on that specific location, there was an understanding that the issue extended beyond it. The case became a reference point, a way of discussing broader patterns of abuse and neglect that often remain hidden. It highlighted the challenges of identifying these situations, of responding effectively when signs are present, but not fully understood. Organizations began to review their practices, not only in response to public pressure, but because the case had exposed vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Training protocols were examined. Procedures were reconsidered. There was an effort, however complex and imperfect, to close the gaps that had been revealed. But change, in systems like these, is rarely immediate. It moves slowly, shaped by policy, by resources, by the realities of implementation. The awareness generated by Gabriel's case created momentum, but translating that momentum into lasting improvement required more than acknowledgement. It required sustained attention. In the broader cultural landscape, the story found another form. Documentaries, discussions, and analyses brought the details of the case to new audiences, presenting not only the facts, but the context surrounding them. These retellings served a dual purpose. They honored Gabriel's story, ensuring that it would not be forgotten, and they continued to raise the questions that had emerged in the aftermath. Because those questions remained relevant. How do we recognize when a child is in danger? How do we ensure that reports lead to meaningful action? How do we balance the complexity of individual cases with the need for consistent protection? There are no simple answers. The case of Gabriel Fernandez did not provide a clear solution, a single change that could guarantee prevention in the future. Instead, it offered a deeper understanding of the challenges involved, the ways in which systems can function as intended and still fall short. And within that understanding, there was something else. A reminder of the human element at the center of it all. Gabriel was not a case study. He was a child whose life contained moments of hope, connection, and resilience, even as it was shaped by circumstances beyond his control. The attention his story received after his death ensured that those moments, however small, would not be entirely overshadowed by the way his life ended. But remembrance carries its own weight. It asks not only that we acknowledge what happened, but that we consider what it means. As time moved forward, the immediate intensity of the case began to fade, as it inevitably does. New stories emerged, new events captured public attention. But for those who had followed Gabriel's story, who had engaged with the questions it raised, the impact did not disappear. It settled into something quieter, but no less significant. A lingering awareness. A recognition that behind the appearance of normalcy, there can exist realities that are far more complex, far more fragile, than they seem. And a question that remains, not just for those directly involved, but for anyone who hears the story. If the signs are there, if the warnings are given, what does it take to ensure that they are truly heard? Time has a way of softening the edges of even the most brutal stories, but in some cases, it doesn't erase the weight, it redistributes it. After the public outrage began to fade and the headlines moved on, the story of Gabriel Fernandez did not disappear. It settled into institutions, into policy discussions, into the quiet spaces where change is debated rather than demanded. What had once been a singular tragedy became a reference point, a case studied not only for what happened, but for what it revealed. In the months and years that followed, internal reviews began within the systems that had intersected with Gabriel's life. These were not public trials, but they carried their own gravity. Documents were revisited, decisions re-examined, timelines reconstructed once again, but this time with a different objective. Not to assign criminal guilt, but to understand procedural failure. The findings were not comfortable. There were moments where intervention had been possible, where the signs had reached a threshold that should have triggered stronger action. There were decisions that, when viewed in isolation, might have seemed reasonable, but in sequence revealed a pattern of underestimation. Risk had been identified, but not escalated. Concern had been documented, but not acted upon with urgency. It became clear that the system had not failed in a single, catastrophic way. It had failed gradually. Each step had contained just enough justification to pass without challenge. Each decision had existed within acceptable boundaries. But together, they formed a pathway that led directly to a child being left in harm's way. This realization forced a shift in how people talked about responsibility. It was no longer sufficient to point only at the individuals who had been convicted in court. Their actions were undeniable, their guilt established. But the question that lingered was more complex. What about the mechanisms that were designed to intervene before it reached that point? The conversation moved into uncomfortable territory. Because addressing systemic failure requires more than identifying mistakes. It requires confronting the limitations of the structures themselves, the way policies are applied, the way judgments are made under pressure, the way uncertainty is handled when the stakes are not fully visible. Professionals within child welfare systems began to speak more openly about these challenges. High caseloads were not an abstract issue, they were a daily reality. Each case carried its own urgency, its own complexity, its own set of unknowns. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information. The threshold for intervention was not always clear, and crossing it could have consequences of its own. These were not excuses. But they were part of the reality. Gabriel's case became a focal point for examining how those realities could be addressed. Training programs were updated to emphasize the importance of pattern recognition, not just individual incidents, but the accumulation of warning signs over time. Greater attention was given to documentation, to ensuring that concerns were not just recorded, but connected. There was also a renewed emphasis on listening. Not just hearing what a child says, but understanding what they might not be able to fully express. Children often communicate in fragments, in partial truths shaped by fear, confusion, or a lack of language to describe their experiences. Recognizing those fragments as part of a larger picture became a central focus. But implementing these changes was not immediate. Policies can be written quickly. Changing how they are applied takes longer. It requires shifts in mindset, in culture, in the way individuals interpret their roles within the system. It requires resources, time, personnel, support, that are not always readily available. And it requires a sustained commitment, one that extends beyond the immediate aftermath of a high-profile case. Outside of institutional settings, the impact of Gabriel's story continued to unfold in quieter ways. Communities became more aware of the signs of abuse, more willing to question what might once have been dismissed as none of their concern. Conversations that had previously been avoided became more common, though not always easier. The idea that harm could exist behind ordinary doors, in familiar environments, became harder to ignore. This awareness carried both potential and complexity. On one hand, it increased the likelihood that warning signs would be noticed, that concerns would be reported. On the other, it introduced new challenges: how to differentiate between situations that required intervention and those that did not, how to respond without overstepping, how to act in ways that were both effective and appropriate. There were no simple guidelines. But there was a growing understanding that silence was not neutral. In the broader cultural landscape, Gabriel's story continued to be told, not just as a narrative of tragedy, but as a case study in failure and consequence. It became part of training materials, part of discussions in classrooms and professional settings. It was analyzed, dissected, revisited from different angles. Each retelling added perspective. Some focused on the psychological dynamics within the household, attempting to understand the motivations and behaviors that led to such sustained harm. Others examined the institutional responses, looking for points where different decisions might have altered the outcome. Together, these perspectives created a more complete picture. But completeness does not equal resolution. There remained elements that could not be fully explained, aspects of human behavior that resist simple categorization. The capacity for harm, the ability to ignore or rationalize warning signs, the interplay between individual action and systemic structure, these are not variables that can be easily controlled. And so, the legacy of the case became something more complex than a single lesson. It became a reminder. A reminder that protection is not a passive state, but an active process. That systems designed to safeguard must be continually evaluated, adjusted, strengthened. That awareness alone is not enough without action to support it. For those who encountered Gabriel's story, whether directly or indirectly, there was often a moment of personal reflection. What would I have done? Would I have recognized the signs? Would I have acted differently? These questions do not have definitive answers, but they serve a purpose. They shift the focus from abstract systems to individual responsibility, from distant events to immediate awareness. Because cases like this do not exist in isolation. They are part of a larger pattern, one that spans communities, institutions, and time. Each instance carries its own details, its own circumstances, but the underlying themes remain consistent. Vulnerability. Opportunity for intervention. The consequences of inaction. As the years pass, Gabriel Fernandez remains part of that pattern, not as a statistic, but as a story that continues to influence how people think about child protection, about responsibility, about the limits of what systems can achieve on their own. His life, though brief, left an imprint that extends beyond the specifics of his case. It exists in the changes that were made, however incremental. In the awareness that was raised, however imperfect. In the questions that continue to be asked, even when answers are difficult to find. And in that sense, the story does not end. It continues, shaped by each new decision, each new case, each new opportunity to recognize what might otherwise remain unseen. In the years after the courtroom doors closed on the Gabriel Fernandez case, something unexpected happened. The story did not remain confined to legal records, documentaries, or institutional reports. It began to evolve in the public consciousness, taking on a different kind of life, one shaped not only by facts, but by reflection, discomfort, and a growing awareness of how fragile protection can be when systems fail in silence. At first, the attention was intense but short-lived. That is often how public outrage behaves. It surges, it demands answers, it searches for accountability, and then it disperses as new events take its place. But in this case, something lingered beneath the surface. A residue of questions that did not dissolve easily. For many who encountered Gabriel's story through documentaries or news coverage, the details were difficult to forget. Not because they were sensational, but because they were ordinary in their setting and extraordinary in their outcome. A child attending school. A home in a suburban neighborhood. Reports filed, concerns raised, visits conducted. Each element, on its own, belonged to the realm of routine child welfare processes. Yet together, they led to something unthinkable. This contradiction became the center of ongoing discussions. How could something so heavily documented still result in such a devastating outcome? Within child welfare circles, the case began to serve as both a reference point and a warning. Training sessions included it as an example of how patterns of risk can be present without triggering decisive intervention. Not because people did not care, but because the interpretation of risk is often shaped by thresholds, guidelines, and limited resources. Those thresholds became a subject of deeper scrutiny. Professionals examined how decisions are made when information is incomplete. A report of concern does not always arrive with clarity. It often comes fragmented, filtered through perception, emotion, and uncertainty. A bruise might be explained. A statement might be inconsistent. A child might appear fearful, but not explicit in their disclosure. In Gabriel's case, those fragments existed in abundance. Individually, they did not always meet the threshold for immediate removal or emergency intervention. But collectively, they formed a pattern that, in hindsight, appears unmistakable. The challenge lay in recognizing that pattern in real time, when each piece was still incomplete. This tension between hindsight and real-time decision-making became central to post-case evaluations. It is easy to see a pattern once it has been fully revealed. It is far more difficult to identify it while it is still forming. As discussions continued, attention also turned to communication between agencies. Teachers, social workers, medical professionals, and law enforcement each held pieces of information, but those pieces were not always connected in a way that allowed for full visibility. Information existed in silos, separated by procedural boundaries that, while designed for organization, sometimes limited holistic understanding. Gabriel's case highlighted the consequences of those gaps. A teacher might notice repeated injuries. A social worker might conduct a home visit. A medical professional might treat unexplained trauma. Each interaction, on its own, addressed a specific moment. But without continuous integration, the broader trajectory could remain obscured. This realization led to calls for improved coordination, better information sharing protocols, and more dynamic systems of risk assessment. The goal was not to assign blame to individuals who had acted within existing frameworks, but to examine whether those frameworks were sufficient for the complexity of real-world situations. Outside institutional settings, the story took on a different form. For the general public, Gabriel became more than a case study. He became a symbol of vulnerability, within systems designed to protect. His name was invoked in discussions about child safety, not as a statistic, but as a reminder of what happens when warning signs are not fully acted upon. This symbolic weight carried both clarity and difficulty. On one hand, it increased awareness. People became more attentive to signs of abuse in their own environments. Conversations about child welfare became more direct, less avoidant. On the other hand, it also introduced emotional complexity. The idea that harm could persist despite multiple points of contact with protective systems was deeply unsettling. It challenged assumptions about safety. In educational settings, Gabriel's case was incorporated into training materials for teachers and administrators. The focus was not on the details of his suffering, but on the indicators that preceded it. Patterns of behavior. Signs of fear. Inconsistencies in explanations. The emphasis was on recognition and response. Students in social work and criminology programs studied the case as part of broader discussions about systemic failure. It was analyzed not only in terms of what went wrong, but in terms of what could be improved. These discussions often extended beyond technical procedures into ethical considerations: how much responsibility rests on individuals versus systems, and where those boundaries should be drawn. Meanwhile, within communities, the impact was quieter but still present. People became more aware of the importance of reporting concerns, even when uncertainty remained. The threshold for speaking up shifted slightly. Where hesitation once existed, there was now a greater willingness to question, to observe, to act. But awareness alone does not eliminate complexity. One of the enduring challenges highlighted by the case is the difficulty of balancing intervention with accuracy. Acting too late can have devastating consequences. Acting too quickly, without sufficient evidence, can also cause harm. Navigating this balance requires judgment under pressure, often in situations where information is incomplete. Gabriel's story exists within that tension. It does not offer a simple resolution, because the systems involved were not operating in a vacuum. They were functioning within constraints, legal, procedural, and practical. Yet those constraints, when combined with missed opportunities for escalation, created space for tragedy to unfold. Over time, the focus of discussions began to shift slightly. Instead of only asking how the system failed, people also began asking how awareness could be sustained. High-profile cases often generate temporary momentum for change, but maintaining that momentum requires ongoing effort. Policies must be updated, training must be reinforced, and attention must not fade as public interest moves elsewhere. In this sense, Gabriel's case became a test of memory as much as of reform. Would the lessons remain present once the immediate emotional impact diminished? Would the changes implemented in response to his case continue to evolve? Or would they gradually fade into existing structures without sustained reinforcement? These questions do not have immediate answers. What remains clear is that the case exposed something fundamental about systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals. They rely not only on rules and procedures, but on interpretation, communication, and the ability to connect fragmented information into a coherent understanding of risk. When any of those elements fail to align, the consequences can be severe. As time continues to pass, Gabriel Fernandez is no longer spoken about only in terms of what happened to him. He is also part of a broader conversation about responsibility, awareness, and the limits of institutional protection. His story is not static. It continues to be revisited, re-examined, and reinterpreted through different lenses: legal, social, educational, and ethical. And within that ongoing reflection, there is a quiet, but persistent recognition that the most important lessons are not always the most comfortable ones. They are the ones that require attention long after the story itself has ended. In the aftermath of cases like Gabriel Fernandez's, time does something complicated to memory. It does not erase what happened, but it rearranges it. The sharpest moments lose some of their immediate intensity, while the broader implications become more visible. What remains is not just the story of a single child, but the reflection of everything that surrounded him, people, systems, decisions, and the spaces between them. Years after the case moved out of active legal proceedings, Gabriel's name continued to appear in conversations that were no longer just about his life or death, but about what his story revealed. It became part of a larger dialogue about child protection in California and beyond, often cited in discussions that sought to understand how prevention could fail even when warning signs were present. Within professional environments, especially in social work and child welfare training, his case remained present as a structured example. Not as a story told for shock value, but as a detailed study in layered failure. It was broken down into segments: initial reports, follow-up visits, documented concerns, and the eventual breakdown in intervention. Each segment was analyzed independently and then reconnected to show how small decisions, each defensible in isolation, could collectively lead to irreversible outcomes. One of the most frequently discussed aspects was the concept of cumulative risk. In many systems, risk is not evaluated as a single event, but as an accumulation of indicators over time. A bruise, a statement from a child, a concerned teacher's report, each contributes to an evolving picture. The challenge lies in determining when that picture becomes clear enough to justify decisive action. In Gabriel's case, that threshold became a focal point of analysis. Some professionals argued that the signals were present but fragmented. Others pointed to structural limitations that made it difficult to consolidate those signals effectively. Caseload pressures, limited time for home visits, and reliance on brief assessments were all identified as contributing factors. But beyond technical explanations, there was a deeper question being raised. How many partial signals are required before certainty becomes responsibility? This question did not have a simple answer. It existed in the space between policy and judgment, between what is written in guidelines and what is experienced in real time. As discussions evolved, attention also turned to the emotional dimension of professional decision-making. Social workers and educators often operate under conditions where they must balance empathy with procedural requirements. They are expected to observe, document, and act, but also to interpret situations that are not always clear. Gabriel's case highlighted how emotionally complex that responsibility can become. A child who does not fully disclose their situation presents a particular challenge. Fear, loyalty, confusion, and survival instincts can all influence what is shared and what remains unspoken. In such cases, professionals must rely not only on what is said, but on patterns of behavior, inconsistencies, and contextual clues. The difficulty lies in interpretation. What one observer sees as a sign of distress, another might view as situational behavior. What one report frames as concerning, another might consider inconclusive. This variability creates space for hesitation, and in systems where action depends on thresholds, hesitation can have significant consequences. In the years following the case, training programs began to place greater emphasis on pattern recognition and interdisciplinary communication. The goal was to reduce fragmentation, to ensure that information from schools, healthcare providers, and social services could be more effectively integrated. Digital systems were updated in some jurisdictions to improve record sharing, allowing different agencies to access consolidated histories rather than isolated reports. The intention was to create continuity, so that no single observation would exist without context. But even with technological improvements, the core challenge remained human. Information still needed to be interpreted. Decisions still needed to be made. An interpretation is influenced by experience, perception, and judgment. Outside of institutional reform, Gabriel's story continued to influence public awareness in more informal ways. It was referenced in discussions about the importance of noticing small signs in everyday life. A child's hesitation, unexplained injuries, changes in behavior, these details, once easy to overlook, began to carry greater significance in public consciousness. The idea that harm can exist behind ordinary appearances became more widely acknowledged. This shift in awareness is subtle but meaningful. It does not guarantee prevention, but it increases the likelihood that concerns will be voiced rather than ignored. It changes the threshold of attention, encouraging people to question what they might otherwise dismiss. At the same time, there is a risk that heightened awareness can lead to uncertainty about when to act. Not every sign indicates abuse. Not every concern requires intervention. Distinguishing between caution and overreaction is part of the ongoing challenge in community-based protection. Gabriel's case sits within this tension. It demonstrates the consequences of missed signals, but it also raises awareness of how complex those signals can be. In academic discussions, particularly in law and social policy, the case is often examined as an example of systemic interaction rather than isolated failure. The focus shifts from individual responsibility alone to the network of decisions and processes that shape outcomes. This perspective does not reduce accountability. Instead, it expands it. It acknowledges that outcomes are rarely the result of a single action. They are the product of sequences, decisions made by different people in different roles, each operating within their own constraints. One of the most enduring aspects of Gabriel's story is the way it continues to prompt reflection on those constraints. How do systems designed to protect also avoid overreach? How do professionals act decisively without complete information? How do institutions maintain both efficiency and depth of assessment? These are not new questions, but the case brought them into sharper focus. In communities where the story is still discussed, there is often a sense of unresolved tension. The legal case is closed. The individuals responsible were held accountable through the justice system. But the broader questions remain active. This is because the case is not only about what happened in one household. It is about the interaction between visibility and invisibility in systems of care. Some forms of suffering are visible and immediate. Others are hidden, gradual, and difficult to distinguish from normal variation in behavior or circumstance. Gabriel's experience fell into the latter category for much of the time leading up to the final events. He was seen, but not fully understood. He was observed, but not fully protected. The information about his situation existed, but it was dispersed across different points of contact, never fully unified into a decisive intervention. That fragmentation is one of the central lessons extracted from the case. As time continues to pass, Gabriel Fernandez remains a reference point in discussions about prevention, responsibility, and systemic awareness. His story is not retold to dwell on tragedy alone, but to examine how similar outcomes might be prevented in the future. It is a reminder that systems are only as effective as their ability to connect information, interpret risk, and act in time. And it is also a reminder that behind every case file, every report, and every policy discussion, there are real lives affected by the limits of those systems. In that sense, Gabriel's story does not end with closure. It continues as a question that persists beyond the courtroom, beyond the investigation, and beyond the policies that were later changed. A question about recognition. A question about response. And ultimately, a question about what it takes to ensure that warnings are not only recorded, but truly heard.